All right, he's heading
As you
north
read
of the
this,
river.
there is a war underway. There is no official
tracking his
declaration.
signal now.
There is no battlefront. There is a looted cryptocurrency exchange, a government in calculated silence, and a military doctrine with a document number that turned private companies into 21st century armies. In June 2025, a private company stole $90 million from an Iranian cryptocurrency exchange called Nobitex. It wasn't a script kiddie stunt. It wasn't opportunistic ransomware. It was a surgical operation executed by a group called Predatory Sparrow. And when the money vanished, the United States government stayed silent. There was no condemnation. There was no publicly announced investigation. There was no speech from diplomats warning about the consequences of attacking the financial systems of sovereign nations. Washington simply said nothing. And this should be the center of your attention right now, because that silence was far from an oversight. Forget political confusion or bureaucratic sluggishness. The lack of response was the system working exactly as designed. Within 90 days, Iran responded with a 700% increase in cyber attacks against American and Israeli targets. 700%. And the data confirms the severity. There were 700 attacks where there used to be 100. And while this escalation was happening, the U.S. government was finalizing a set of documents that made official what until then existed only in the shadows. A doctrine that authorizes private companies to wage cyber warfare on behalf of sovereign states. That is what we are going to dissect today. Not as science fiction, not as a conspiracy theory, as documented public policy, with a document number, letterhead, and a signature at the bottom. But before we get to the doctrine, let's understand exactly why the Nobitex heist is different from anything that came before it. Because there is a fundamental difference between what happened to Nobitex and previous cyber heists. Other groups hacked banks for money. Other groups spied on governments for intelligence. But Predatory Sparrow hit a national Iranian exchange, an institution that serves as the financial infrastructure of a sovereign state. And the American response was strategic silence. Far from being indifference, it was a purely tactical omission. There is a difference, and it reveals everything about the system that has been built over the last 10 years. The question that remains open since that heist is simple. When exactly did governments decide that private companies could do this? And who made that decision? You are going to find out exactly when and how this was signed. The document number, the letterhead, and what it authorizes that no news outlet will put in a headline. But to understand why this happened, we must first understand the document that made it all inevitable. The United States Department of Defense doesn't improvise. Every major strategic decision has a document, an acronym, an approval chain. And when the Pentagon decided to turn cyberspace into a privatized war zone, it was no different. The document is called AFDP 3-12, Air Force Doctrine Publication 3-12. It's an American Air Force doctrine document, and it formally introduces a concept that would be translated to the public as cost imposition, or, in more direct strategic vocabulary, risk imposition. The core logic is elegant in its brutal simplicity. If you can't defeat an adversary directly, you make them more expensive. You don't destroy the enemy's capability, you raise the price of using that capability. Every operation the adversary executes needs to cost more than what they gain. If the cost of maintaining an intelligence operation increases 15-fold, the adversary is forced to make choices. If attacking American infrastructure results in retaliation that costs more than the attack yielded, the calculus changes. That is cost imposition. The problem is that imposing costs on a massive scale requires operational capacity that the state cannot muster alone. The best vulnerability analysts don't work in the federal government. They work at cybersecurity startups in Tel Aviv, San Francisco, and London. The most sophisticated network penetration tools didn't come out of Pentagon labs. They came from private companies with venture capital and market incentives. The speed of innovation in the private sector is orders of magnitude higher than any government acquisition structure can keep up with. So, the doctrine met the market. And when it met with force. Because the private cybersecurity sector didn't just have the tools, it also had the business model that made expansion natural. A commercial spyware company doesn't need congressional approval to develop a new capability. It doesn't need to go through 3-year acquisition cycles. It doesn't need to justify expenses to oversight committees. It follows the market. And when the market is the security apparatus of the most powerful state in the world, investment in offensive capabilities becomes practically guaranteed. This transition didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, carefully structured to preserve the deniability that any sovereign state needs when operating in the gray zone of international law. After all, a private company attacking another country's infrastructure escapes the formal definition of an act of war under the Westphalian Treaty. It becomes classified as a commercial incident, a dispute between private entities. Lawyers can work with that. Pay attention to this detail, because this is where everything changes. Privatization was far from a side effect of the doctrine. It was a central, planned feature. The ability to operate at a plausible distance from the state. What strategists call plausible deniability only exists if there is a private layer genuinely separated from the formal command structure. AFDP 3.12 didn't just allow this. It required it as an operational condition. This was thought out. This was designed. And it has consequences that no situation room in the Pentagon could have fully calculated when the doctrine was written. The question that remains open is, when a doctrine requires a private layer to function, who exactly fills that layer? You'll recognize the names, and it will change what you think when you see their logos. To understand these consequences, you need to know who filled this space when the doctrine opened the door. So, who are these companies? When we say that the private sector was mobilized for cyber warfare, who are we talking about exactly? The ecosystem has 3 distinct functional layers, and they operate in parallel without necessarily communicating directly. And when you understand how each one works, you'll realize you can't dismantle one without collapsing the others. The first layer is commercial spyware. These are the companies you've probably heard of, at least through scandals: NSO Group, Candiru, Intellexa, Cytrox. These organizations develop and sell sophisticated surveillance tools to governments officially to fight terrorism and organized crime. In practice, the market is much more promiscuous. Journalists, activists, opposition leaders, allied diplomats, all have been documented targets of the exact same tools that states bought under the guise of national security. In March 2026, the U.S. government added 3 of these companies to its restricted entity list, which essentially means no American company can do business with them. This is significant because it happened in the exact same month the cost imposition doctrine was formalized into official policy. The very tools being designated as threats to American national security were, simultaneously, part of the operational architecture the Pentagon was canonizing. This paradox is no accident. It's the reflection of a system operating on simultaneous logics that contradict each other on paper, but coexist in practice. The second layer is more surprising. Big Tech: Google, Microsoft, CrowdStrike, Cloudflare. You know them as defenders, as the organizations that secure networks, identify threats, and warn about vulnerabilities. And they do that. But in January 2026, Google took a step that redefined what defender means. Google actively dismantled a residential proxy network called IPedia and infrastructure. that state actors used to mask the origin of offensive cyber operations. This move went far beyond any definition of passive defense, consisting of a direct disruption of adversary infrastructure. Google wasn't just protecting its users, it was attacking the operational capability of nation-states. This distinction matters. Defending networks is reacting. Dismantling adversary infrastructure is acting. And when Google acts this way, an American private company attacking infrastructure used by foreign governments, the line between the corporate sector and the war apparatus dissolves in a way no international treaty was written to address. The third layer is the most opaque: cyber mercenaries with implicit state affiliation. Predatory Sparrow, the group that stole 90 million from Novatex, fits right in here. Just like Salt Typhoon and Venus Tech, which are the Chinese mirrors of the American model. These groups operate with resources that suggest state backing, execute operations serving the strategic interests of specific states, and maintain a carefully constructed distance from any formal command structure. They are, for all practical purposes, private armies of the cyber domain. And the very trait that makes them most useful to the state is what makes them most dangerous to the international system. They respond to market incentives, not command orders. When the contract changes, loyalty shifts with it. When a new opportunity arises, the group migrates. There is no civilian equivalent for what happens when a cyber mercenary decides to change employers, or when they decide to work for multiple at the same time. And now comes the piece that closes our first open question. Google and NSO Group appear in the exact same operational framework, but for completely different reasons. One is imposing costs on adversaries. The other is being restricted because it became indistinguishable from an adversary actor. The boundary between tool and threat, between ally and risk, has blurred completely. It has become a gray zone that the Doctrine deliberately inhabited. But when exactly did this become official policy? When did the government stop tolerating this gray area and start codifying it? March 6, 2026. Remember that date. Analysts at the Atlantic Council described the move as the greatest reconfiguration of cyber power since the creation of Cybercom. Researchers at the Center for Strategic and International Studies had already warned that the lack of a clear legal framework for private offensive operations was a regulatory time bomb waiting to go off. Both were right. They just didn't know the detonation would come on presidential letterhead. On that day, the Trump administration released two documents that, together, represent the biggest transformation in American cyber doctrine since cyberspace was declared the fifth military domain. The first was the National Cybersecurity Strategy. The second was an executive order detailing how the private sector will be mobilized for offensive operations. But here is what the documents say, and what they deliberately don't say. What they say: the private sector is a strategic asset in the cyber domain. American companies have the capability, the global footprint, and the operational speed that the federal government simply cannot replicate. The national strategy must coordinate these capabilities to impose costs on adversaries who attack American infrastructure. What they don't say: exactly what is legal. The authorization for private offensive operations remains deliberately ambiguous. The executive order doesn't define which types of operations are authorized. It doesn't specify the approval process required before a private company attacks foreign infrastructure. It doesn't outline what happens if a private operation causes civilian casualties, takes down critical infrastructure in an allied country, or escalates into a conventional armed conflict. This goes way beyond legislative negligence. What we're looking at here is pure legal engineering. The legal ambiguity is a feature, not a bug. It serves two strategic purposes simultaneously. First, it preserves state deniability. If there is no explicit, documented authorization for a specific operation, the government can distance itself from any unwanted outcomes. Second, it prevents adversaries from accurately calculating what will or won't trigger an American response. Uncertainty is, in and of itself, a form of deterrence. The comparison with the previous stance is revealing. The Biden-era Defend Forward doctrine authorized proactive offensive cyber operations as an extension of defense, but they were conducted primarily by military and intelligence operatives with formal authorizations within clear command structures. What the March 2026 order does is explicitly shift this center of gravity to the private sector, maintaining legal ambiguity as a structural shield. The fifth military domain no longer belongs exclusively to the military, and the question of who decides what is or isn't an act of war in this domain remains, by design, officially unanswered. This opens up a question that the next section answers in a way you won't forget. If private companies can now wage cyber wars with implicit state support, who is responsible when something goes wrong? The answer? No one. And that's no accident. It has a 250-year-old historical precedent. In 1776, the United States government formally authorized private citizens to capture enemy ships. They called them letters of marque. A merchant, an adventurer, a ship's captain could receive a license from the government to attack vessels from hostile nations. They weren't pirates, technically. They were licensed privateers. The legal distinction mattered because, with the letter, they were protected by the international law of the nations that authorized them. Without it, they would be executed. Now, fast forward 250 years. In 2025, the U.S. Congress proposed the Scam Farms Mark and Reprisal Authorization Act. The name alone should be enough. Mark and reprisal is the exact terminology from the 18th century letters. The bill proposes authorizing private entities to conduct offensive cyber operations against nation-states deemed responsible for attacks on American infrastructure. This comparison goes beyond any metaphorical exaggeration. The parallel is structurally identical, and the fact that the U.S. Congress specifically chose this terminology, rather than inventing a new one, says something about the historical awareness of whoever drafted the bill. They knew exactly the precedent they were invoking. The 18th century privateer received state authorization to attack enemy ships, with the legal protection that the action was commercial, not military. The 21st century private cyber operator would receive state authorization to attack foreign infrastructure, with the legal protection that the action is commercial, not military. The license is what separates the pirate from the privateer. The license is what separates the cybercriminal from the authorized operator. And with the Scam Farms Act, Congress is formalizing this mechanism for the digital domain. But here is the detail that the text doesn't resolve. When an 18th century privateer captured a ship, and the operation spiraled out of control, when civilians died, when the damage exceeded what was authorized, there were accountability mechanisms, however imperfect. Captains could be prosecuted. Nations could be held diplomatically accountable. There was a chain of consequences, even if it was a slow one. In the current cyber model, what are these mechanisms? If a private company authorized, implicitly, deliberately, ambiguously, by the American government destroys the energy infrastructure of an adversary country, and this results in civilian deaths, who is held accountable? The company claims it followed what was implicitly authorized. The government claims it never explicitly authorized that specific operation. The affected country has no effective international forum to prosecute either of them. The international tribunal competent to judge acts of war between states does not recognize private entities as subjects of international humanitarian law in the same way it recognizes state armed forces. International law was built for wars between states. When war is waged by corporations, the existing legal framework produces loopholes that corporate lawyers exploit for decades before any reform is possible. The accountability vacuum isn't an unexpected consequence of the model. It's a structurally necessary consequence for the model to work. Without this vacuum, the state would need to take responsibility for the operations, which would destroy the deniability that is the sole reason the model exists. Accountability and deniability are mutually exclusive. You choose one. The doctrine has chosen. And now that the American model is formalized, the next question is the one every adversary power has already answered operationally. What stops every other country from doing exactly the same? Nothing. In August 2025, 74 countries worldwide had documented capability to deploy commercial spyware. In 2015, there were 40. This reflects much more than an abstract data point. It's a proliferation map indicating that the American model has been copied by more than half of the UN member states. And what this number reveals is systematically more alarming than it seems. Among these 74 countries are close allies of the United States using these tools against each other. It's not just Russia, China, and Iran. It's NATO countries. It's strategic partners in the Indo-Pacific. It's nations that sign mutual non-espionage agreements in public spaces and use commercial spyware against those same partners in the shadows. The proliferation of the American doctrine occurred regardless of any intention to export it through policy. It simply became inevitable. When you demonstrate that a model works and produces results, any actor with resources will replicate it. And China has already replicated it. Salt Typhoon operates at a level far superior to that of a freelance hacker group. It is a structured network of cyber mercenaries affiliated with the Chinese state, operating with the same plausible distance from formal command that groups in the American ecosystem utilize. Venus Tech is another component of this architecture. Companies that officially sell cybersecurity services and, in practice, function as the offensive arm of the Chinese intelligence apparatus. This is China's answer to predatory Sparrow, to CrowdStrike, to the ecosystem that Washington built over a decade and formalized in March 2026. Instead of being contested diplomatically, the model ended up being widely replicated operationally. And this is exactly the consequence that the cost imposition logic generates when applied without institutional breaks. It exports the model before any international agreement can regulate it. Now look at what the Iran-Israel case tells us about how this system behaves when pressure is applied from one side. Predatory Sparrow steals $90 million from Nobitex in June 2025. Iran, without access to effective international forums to seek reparations, without legal means to hold a private Israeli-American company accountable, does what any rational actor does when the legal option is closed. It uses what it has: a 700% increase in attacks. Far from any irrationality, this represents the natural response of a state that has learned, by observing the adversary's model, that the cost of not retaliating is greater than the cost of retaliating. And here is where the cost imposition doctrine structurally collapses on itself. It assumes the adversary will calculate that the cost of responding outweighs the cost of absorbing. But when you impose costs using a model that operates in the legal gray zone, where attacks are attributed to private entities, where responsibility is deliberately diffuse, the adversary has no way of signaling that it has accepted the terms. There is no negotiating table to end a conflict that neither party officially acknowledges fighting. So the only available language is escalation. And the escalation is getting faster. The structural problem with the escalation cycle is that each side interprets the other's response as new aggression, not as a reaction to previous aggression. Iran doesn't see the 700% increase as proportional retaliation to the Nobitex theft. It sees it as an offensive capability that will need to be answered. Israel and the United States, in turn, see the Iranian intensification as justification for future operations. There is no referee. There is no clear signal that one party accepts the terms. The cycle is self-sustaining by design. Throughout 2025, state actors began deploying AI-driven polymorphic phishing malware that changes its signature in real time, adapting to evade detection as it spreads. This scenario is no longer theoretical and is already in use across corporate and infrastructure networks that you likely use or rely on to operate. Each iteration of the AI models powering these tools makes them faster, harder to attribute, and more capable of causing substantial damage before any conventional defense system can respond. The next phase of privatized cyber warfare has already begun without a formal announcement. No official date. No presidential speech. It's already in operation while this video plays. The lingering question is there any mechanism in the world capable of stopping this spiral? There is one, and it's falling way behind. Imagine diplomats in London negotiating the terms of an agreement on commercial cyber tools, while, at the very same time, a company in Tel Aviv delivers a new version of spyware with capabilities those diplomats don't even know exist yet. That is the Pall Mall process in action. It's a UK-led initiative aimed at creating an international code of conduct for the commercial cyber tools market. It brings together governments, tech companies, and researchers with the ambition of establishing what can and cannot be sold, to whom, and with what transparency and accountability requirements. It's the only institutional mechanism with any real pretense of regulating what you just heard. And it's operating at a diplomatically appropriate speed, while the doctrine it's trying to regulate operates at market speed. This realization goes beyond a simple critique of the process. It reflects a direct description of a structural incompatibility. Multilateral norm-making processes operate on a scale of years. The commercial cyber tools market operates on a scale of months. The Scam Farms Act was proposed in 2025. The executive order came out in March 2026. Pall Mall is still negotiating the terms of a framework that would make part of this architecture regulated. The speed gap cannot be bridged with more meetings. But the problem runs deeper than speed. There's also a definitional issue that Pall Mall hasn't resolved yet. What exactly counts as a commercial cyber tool when companies like Google, which sell infrastructure services to billions of people, also conduct offensive operations against adversarial networks? The line between commercial product and state weapon has never been blurrier. Any international code of practice for commercial cyber tools only works if the states that stand to gain the most from it are willing to limit their own capabilities first. And no state wants to be the first to put their weapon down while their adversary is still holding theirs. The United States won't limit its ecosystem of private operators, while China is actively building the equivalent. China won't limit its network of cyber mercenaries, while the US maintains a model that has proven to work. Iran won't dismantle its retaliatory capability, while Predatory Sparrow still exists, and Predatory Sparrow will continue to exist because it's simply too useful for any government responsible for its existence to publicly take responsibility for dismantling it. This is the central deadlock that the cost imposition doctrine has created. It requires ambiguity to work, but ambiguity prevents de-escalation. You can't negotiate the end of a conflict that neither side officially acknowledges they're fighting. What to watch for in the coming months is telling. When the number of countries with commercial spyware capabilities surpasses 90, and it will, the political pressure on mechanisms like Pall Mall will mount. But the speed of adopting any binding code will remain slow, because no state will sign a document limiting capabilities that its main adversary can ignore. When the next Novatech-style incident happens, and it will happen, the response won't be a 700% increase in attacks. It will be more, And if the target is physical infrastructure, power grids, water supply systems, military communications, what begins as a private cyber operation will generate pressure for a response that no longer fits within the digital domain. AI-driven polymorphic phishing makes attribution harder. And without clear attribution, the political pressure to respond falls on the state that was attacked, not on the private company that executed the attack. The state responds with the tools it has. Some of those tools are not cyber in nature. This is the spiral. Far from mere speculation, this is cementing itself as the operational logic of the system that was formalized on March 6, 2026, built on a doctrine with a document number, a letterhead, and decades of institutional evolution behind it. What makes this situation especially hard to reverse is that there is no single decision-maker who can shut the system down. American doctrine isn't controlled by one person or agency. It is distributed among the Pentagon, the White House, dozens of private companies, and the market that binds them. For the spiral to slow down, each of these actors would have to simultaneously recalculate their incentives in the same direction. This has never happened in history for any conventional weapons system. It is even less likely for a cyber system where private actors operate with real autonomy. The cost imposition doctrine was built to make wars cheaper for the state using it. What it didn't account for, or accounted for and accepted as a strategic trade-off, is that it also makes wars cheaper for everyone else. And when wars get cheaper, they get more frequent. You won't see the next major incident announced. You won't see a newspaper headline saying, "Private company starts war against sovereign state." You'll see a cryptocurrency exchange looted. A power grid that goes down for 8 hours, only to come back online with a technical note about emergency maintenance. A telecom company that detects anomalous traffic and can't trace its origin. And at some point, one of these incidents is going to trigger a response that will no longer fit into any reasonable definition of cyberspace. The Pall Mall process is still ongoing. Working groups meet. Documents are drafted. And the market keeps operating at speeds that no diplomatic process was built to keep up with. The next video dives into the AI architecture accelerating this spiral, the models making polymorphic phishing indistinguishable from legitimate communication, and what that means for any defense system still relying on attribution. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss it. And if someone you know still thinks 21st century wars happen on battlefields, share this video. The war has already begun. The problem is that it was privatized before anyone decided the rules.